The grass was still green. That's the detail I couldn't get past. The one that stayed lodged in me like a splinter that worked its way too deep to ever dig out. 40,000 seats rising up into the cold afternoon above me. Half of them still holding people who would never stand up again. And the pitch was still that impossible Premier League green. The kind they paint into the turf with mowing patterns, light stripe and dark stripe, alternating from one touchline to the other. The kind of green that costs more per square meter to maintain than most people's gardens. And a man in a steward's high-visibility vest was crawling across the center circle, dragging both his legs behind him like they belonged to someone else, like they were 2 sacks of wet sand he'd been told to pull and had long since forgotten why. I was watching it through a maintenance window 6 feet underground, my cheek pressed against the cold, reinforced glass, my breath fogging a small oval that I kept having to wipe clear with my sleeve. When the steel door behind me finally sealed with a sound like a vault breathing in. A deep pneumatic suck, and then the 4 hydraulic dogs driving home, one after another, thunk, 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 thunk. Each one a small earthquake that came up through the soles of my boots and into the long bones of my legs. My name is Daniel Vos. I was the facilities engineer for that stadium for 11 years. I knew every pipe, every cable run, every drainage channel under that pitch, every junction box and every sump pump, and every place where the damp got in when the rain came sideways off the estuary in November. I knew about the bunker because I'd inspected it twice a year and signed the same dull compliance form every time, the same clipboard, the same box ticking, the same board signature scrawled at the bottom of the same page. Emergency containment and assembly, sub-level 2. Built into the foundations after the bombing scare in the 90s, back when stadiums first started thinking seriously about the worst things people could do to a crowd. Air handling, water reserve, blast doors, 60 bunk capacity. I had always thought of it as a box that would never be opened. A thing that existed on paper to satisfy an insurer and a council inspector, like a fire axe behind a pane of glass that nobody ever truly imagines swinging. There were 19 of us in it now, and the green grass above us, glimpsed through one small armored window before the door cut it off forever, was the last beautiful thing any of us would see for a very long time. Before I tell you what happened down there, I want to say something to the people who keep coming back to these stories, and to anyone hearing my voice for the first time. Thank you for being here. If this kind of grounded survival story is your thing, stay with the channel, leave a comment, and let me know you're listening, because it genuinely keeps these going. Now, let me take you back to the moment the door sealed, because that was when the real problem started. The door sealing should have made me feel safe. It didn't. My heart should have slowed when those 4 dogs drove home, and I knew that nothing on the other side of 8 inches of steel could reach us, not in a day, not in a year. Instead, it sped up, kicking against my ribs, because in the second after the seal closed, I had already understood 2 things that didn't fit together. The man who pulled the lever to seal that door wasn't supposed to be down there at all. And the manifest of 19 people I'd counted in my head, counted 3 separate times on the way down, because counting is the thing my hands and my mind do when everything else is coming apart, didn't match the 20 bodies of heat the air system was now telling me, in its own quiet mechanical voice, that it had to cool. I need to back up. The afternoon had started normal, and that's the part nobody believes when I tell it. People want the apocalypse to announce itself. They want a sky that turns the wrong color, a siren, a warning crawl scrolling across the bottom of the television. It doesn't work that way. It comes in on an ordinary Saturday, smelling of fried onions and cold air. And that's exactly what makes it unsurvivable for so many people. Because by the time you understand it's happening, you are already standing inside it, up to your neck. It was a Saturday, a cup tie, kickoff at 3. I'd been in since 6 in the morning, because the undersoil heating had thrown a fault overnight. And I wanted the pitch sensors reading clean before the broadcast trucks went live, and started asking the head groundsman why one corner of his perfect pitch was running 2 degrees warmer than the rest. I remember the smell of cut grass at dawn, and the diesel from the first delivery lorries reversing into the loading bay, and later, the frying onions from the concourse vendors firing up their griddles while the gates were still shut. I remember the away fans coming off the trains in a long bright river of color, scarves and shirts, that low rolling chant that builds for an hour before kickoff. The sound of a few thousand voices finding the same rhythm without anyone standing up front to conduct them. 41,000 tickets sold. A full house on a cold, bright day, the kind of day where you can see your own breath in the deep shadow of the stands, but the sun lies warm across the seats that face it. I want you to hold that picture, that ordinary, beautiful, sold-out Saturday, because everything that came after happened directly underneath it. The first sign that something was wrong came not from the crowd, but from my radio. I carry a facilities channel, separate from stadium security. A battered old handset clipped to my belt that mostly carries complaints about blocked toilets and a floodlight ballast that won't strike on a cold morning. At 2:20, I heard one of the matchday medical team request a stretcher to the away end, block 114. Routine. People faint. People drink too much before kickoff. People have heart attacks at football matches far more often than you'd ever guess. And the medical teams are good, fast, professional, in and out before most of the crowd notices a gap in the seats. I didn't even look up from the drain valve I was checking. Then a second request came through. A different voice, a different block entirely. Then a third, within 90 seconds, all of them from different parts of the ground. And that's the moment I straightened up and set my tools down on the lip of the channel. Because that is not routine. A single fault is bad luck. 3 identical faults in 90 seconds is a system failure. And 11 years of keeping a building alive had wired me all the way down to hear the difference between the two. A single fuse blows because the fuse was old and tired. 3 blow at the same instant because something is wrong upstream of all 3 of them, something feeding them all. I went up to the control room because that's where the camera feeds were. Taking the bare service stairs 2 at a time, my keys jangling against my hip with every step. The matchday safety officer was a woman named Priya Nair. Sharp, calm, the best in the business, 20-some years of crowds, and the rare disasters stacked up behind her. And she was already standing at the monitor wall with her arms crossed tight across her chest. And a look on her face I'd never once seen on her in the 6 seasons we'd worked the same building. Priya had a face built for staying calm under pressure. It was a large part of what made her so good. And the calm had cracked, just slightly, just at the corners of her eyes and in the hard set of her jaw. The way a wall cracks long before anyone standing in front of it can tell that the foundation underneath has already shifted. On the screens, in 3 separate blocks across the bowl, people were collapsing, not fainting. Fainting is a slow, soft fold, a person going down by degrees as the blood leaves their head, hands reaching for the seat in front. This was something else. This was collapse, and then convulsion. A hard, full-body seizure, heels drumming against concrete, arms locked. And the people around them were doing the only decent human thing. Standing back, giving room, calling out for help, holding up their phones, scanning the aisles for a steward in a yellow vest. And then the ones who had collapsed got up. I want to be precise about this because the precision is the entire horror. And the imprecise versions people whisper to each other now are somehow always less frightening than the truth of it. They did not get up the way a person gets up. There was no dazed moment of confusion, no hand braced on the armrest, no looking around to work out where they were and what had happened. 1 second they were down on the concrete in the full grip of a seizure, and the next they were simply standing. And the standing was wrong in a way that took my mind a beat too long to name. The weight pushed forward onto the balls of the feet, the spine not quite straight, the head canted over at an angle a living neck does not comfortably hold for more than a moment. And then the nearest person to the first one, a man in a replica home shirt with a scarf knotted at his throat. A man who had bent down to help a stranger, went down himself with the standing thing's teeth buried deep in the meat of his shoulder. And Block 114 became something I will be seeing behind my eyes for the rest of my life, in the dark, every single time I close them. Priya said one word into her radio, and her voice did not shake. And that is the thing I will always respect her for, before anything else. Lockdown. And the stadium's lockdown procedure, designed for a terrorist attack, designed to slam the exits and contain a crowd so an attacker couldn't slip out into the streets and a stampede couldn't crush people in the gates, became in that instant the single worst thing we could possibly have done, because it sealed 40,000 people inside a concrete bowl, together with a thing that spread by touch. Every exit gate clamped shut on its electromagnets, every turnstile locked solid. The crowd that should have been pouring out into the car parks and the streets, thinning, scattering, surviving, was instead held tight inside the bowl, like water cupped in a hand. I am not going to walk you through all of it, because some of it I can't, and some of it you do not need to carry. The control room had glass walls, floor to ceiling, looking out and down over the pitch and the lower tiers. And we watched the away end turn first, because that is where it started. And then we watched it cross the stadium, not the way fire spreads, but the way sound does. That is the closest I have ever been able to get to describing it. It moved like a wave of noise rolling around the inside of a bowl. A Mexican wave made of horror. A band of standing and falling and standing again that traveled around the tiers in something like 11 minutes. 11 minutes for 40,000 people. I timed it later, frame by frame, from the camera logs, when I had nothing else to do down in that hole, but go through the footage and torture myself with the arithmetic of it. 11 minutes. I have done the sum so many times, it sits behind my eyes now, whether I want it there or not. Because the sum is the only way my particular mind knows how to hold a thing that large without it crushing me flat. The control room held 9 of us when Priya sealed the door. Priya herself, 2 of her security officers, 3 broadcast people who'd been in for a pre-match production meeting and frozen against the glass with their headsets still around their necks. A St. John's ambulance volunteer named Carl, who had come up to report a casualty and never left. A club director named Heath, who'd been showing a sponsor around the executive level, and me. The sponsor didn't make it into the room. He froze in the open doorway, half in and half out, staring down at what was happening on the pitch, with his mouth slightly open. And Priya made the decision to seal the door with him on the wrong side of it. The flat of her hand against his chest, one hard shove back into the corridor, and the look that crossed her face in the half second she did it told me she would carry that the exact same way I carry the 11 minutes. We don't talk about it. We never have, in all the time since. Some things you simply carry side by side without ever once naming them out loud. The control room was not safe. I knew that even as we crowded into it, shoulder to shoulder, It had glass walls, and glass is not a wall. It had a single door, and a door that opens is not a seal. And it shared its air supply with the rest of the building through the same ductwork that fed the corporate boxes, which meant it shared its air with whatever was moving through those boxes now. So when Priya finally turned to me, after the worst of the wave had rolled past and the screen showed nothing but a bowl full of slow, wrong movement, and asked me the question every safety officer eventually asks the engineer in the room, which was simply, "Where do we go?" I already had the answer. I had it, I realized, since the third stretcher call. Some part of me, the part that maps a building for a living, had already gone walking through the place in my head, looking for the one room that was built from the ground up to be sealed against the world. "There's a bunker," I said. "Sub-level 2, under the West Stand foundations. Blast doors, sealed air, its own water tank. We can get to it through the service tunnels without going through a single public area. We never have to go near the bowl." Heath, the director, said the bunker was a myth. He said it with the particular flat confidence of a man who has sat on the board for 6 years and quietly decided that means he already knows everything worth knowing about the building. He'd never heard of it, he said, and if it existed, he'd have been told. I told him, as gently as I could manage, with my own hands beginning to shake now that the adrenaline had somewhere to go, that he hadn't been told because it was never a feature anyone advertised. It was a liability you maintained quietly, a line item buried in the annual maintenance budget under structural compliance, and that I personally held the keys and the codes and the entire floor plan in my head from 11 years of signing the same dull form. Priya did not waste a second of breath on the argument. She had already pulled up the building schematic on the central monitor and was tracing the service corridors with one steady finger. And I watched her find the route from the control room down to the West Stand Foundation stairwell faster than half my own maintenance staff could have managed it. She had the kind of mind that could read a building the way other people read a sentence, left to right, no effort showing. "Show me where we lose line of sight to the public areas," she said. And I leaned over her shoulder, close enough to smell the cold sweat starting under the calm. And I showed her, my finger tracking the painted corridors. And together, we built the road in under a minute, every corner, every door. Then she turned to the room, full of frightened people, and told them, in that flat, unshakable voice, exactly where we were going and exactly how we were going to get there. And nobody argued, not even Heath, because in a moment like that, people will follow the one voice that doesn't shake, the way iron filings follow a magnet. Getting down there is its own story, and I'll keep it short, because the bunker is what matters. The bunker is the whole promise. The bunker is the thing the entire nightmare was quietly built around. We moved through the guts of the stadium, the corridors the fans never see, the bare painted breeze block and the overhead cable trays and the smell of damp and diesel and industrial floor cleaner. The fluorescent tubes humming overhead, one of them strobing on and off in a way I'd been meaning to fix for a month and now never would. Priya took point. I took the rear because I knew the route, and a man at the back who knows the route can stop people peeling off down the wrong corridor in their panic. We picked up survivors as we went, the way a river picks up whatever has fallen into it. A groundsman named Ferdy, who had locked himself in the mower store at the first scream, and who came out white-faced and shaking when he heard my voice through the door. Because he knew my voice, 11 years of working the same turf in all weathers. A father and his 2 children, a boy of maybe 10 and a girl of maybe 8, who had been up in a hospitality box and gotten separated from the mother somewhere in the chaos of the corridors. And the father's face, when he said the single word separated, was a closed door I knew better than to push on. Then, or ever after. A turnstile operator who'd had the presence of mind to drop the steel security shutter on her own gate and then climb back over into the staff side. A pair of catering staff still in their long aprons, one of them with a tea towel still hung over his shoulder, because the body does that in a catastrophe. It holds on to the small, ordinary thing in its hand, while the whole world ends around it. By the time we reached the blast door at the bottom of the West Stand Foundation stairwell, we were 19. I want you to understand the door properly, because the door is the whole promise of what saved us, and the whole shape of what damned us. It is a steel plug door, 8 inches thick, set into a frame that was cast directly into the foundation pour, which means the frame is not bolted onto the structure, it is the structure, poured as one single piece with the load-bearing concrete that holds up the entire West Stand. It seals with a central mechanical wheel that drives 4 hydraulic dogs out into the frame. The same basic principle as a ship's watertight bulkhead, but heavier, rated to hold against blast overpressure. When it is shut, it is shut. 40,000 of anything pressing against it from the outside would not move that door, not in a year, not in 10 years. I had tested the seal myself, every single inspection, with a smoke pencil and a pressure gauge, watching the smoke for the smallest curl that would betray a leak. And I had signed it off as good every time. The bunker behind it was 2 rooms and a short connecting corridor. Low-ceilinged, lit by emergency LEDs on their own dedicated circuit. With steel bunks folded down flat along the walls, a chemical toilet block behind a curtain at the far end. A water tank holding 3,000 liters set down into the floor. And an air handling unit housed in a steel cabinet that scrubbed and recirculated the internal air, rather than drawing anything in from outside, because the entire point of a bunker, the whole philosophy cast into it, is that you do not trust the outside air. You assume the outside air is the thing trying to kill you. That assumption is built right into the steel. I got everyone through. I stood at the threshold and counted them in, touching the cold steel of the frame with 2 fingers as each one stepped past me into the red light. The way you count sheep through a gate. And I counted 19. And then I went last. The way you're supposed to. Because the man who knows the door should be the man who closes it on himself. I stepped over the raised lip of the threshold, into the warm, recycled air and the deep red glow. And I put both hands on the wheel, and I spun it. And it was stiff. It always was. And I had to plant my feet and put my back into it. And the 4 dogs drove home one after another with that thunk, 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 thunk. And the world outside became a thing that happened on the far side of 8 inches of steel. And that is when I heard the air handling unit change its tone. It was a small thing. A half-tone rise in the fan, the sound of a system quietly recalculating its load and spinning up to meet it. Anyone else in that room would not have caught it at all, would not have been able to pick it out from the general low hum of the place. But I had listened to that unit twice a year for 11 years, with my ear right against the cabinet and a stethoscope on the bearing housing. I knew its voice, the way you know the voice of a relative on the telephone before they've said their name. And that half-tone rise meant the unit had just sensed more heat and more exhaled carbon dioxide than it had been balancing a moment earlier, and was now working harder to scrub it back out. The unit, which measures the load second by second and adjusts itself without anyone telling it to, had just told me there were more people breathing in that room than the count I had carried so carefully down the stairs. I had counted 19. I had counted them at the mower store, and again at the locked turnstile, and a 3rd time as they filed through the door. Because counting is what I do when I'm frightened. It is the thing my hands reach for. But the air unit, which does not get frightened and never loses count, was now balancing the room for 20. I turned around slowly in that low red room. and I looked at the faces, the 19 frightened faces I had led down through the dark. And I started counting them again, my finger moving very slightly at my side. One ticked to a face, and this time I reached 20. And the 20th was a man standing at the back near the lip of the water tank. A man I did not remember coming down the stairs, did not remember counting through the door, did not remember at all. He was wearing a steward's vest, the high-visibility kind, lemon yellow with silver reflective bands across the chest and back. And he was very still in a room full of people who could not stop shaking. And he was smiling at me. The smile was the wrong part. It did not reach the rest of his face. It arrived about a half second after his eyes had already settled on mine, like a subtitle running a beat behind the speech. I'll get to him. But first, I need you to understand the bunker properly, the way I came to understand it. Because for the first day and a half, the bunker did exactly what it had been built to do. And that is a kind of small, quiet miracle I had never once in my life expected to witness from the inside. The air came clean and cool, scrubbed of the carbon dioxide and the fear sweat and the sour smell of 19 unwashed, terrified people sealed up in a box. The water came cold out of the single tap when you turned it, drawn up from the 3,000-liter tank by a small electric pump that ticked over softly somewhere under the floor. The LEDs held steady at their low emergency level, that deep red that is gentle on the eyes and gentle on the battery both. We had 19 people, 20 in a space rated for 60, which meant we had room to spread out along the bunks, room for the 2 children to lie down and, eventually, exhausted clean past the point of fear, to actually sleep. Room for Carl, the medic, to claim a corner near the toilet block and lay out his small St. John's kit by feel in the red light, sorting gauze from tape from antiseptic by touch alone. Nobody had been bitten. That was the thing that mattered more than the water or the air or the steel or anything else. And Carl understood it before any of us. And he checked every single one of us, twice, peeling back collars and rolling up sleeves and turning hands over to check the knuckles, checking the 2 children's thin arms and the backs of their necks while their father stood over them with his jaw clenched so hard I could see the muscle jumping. Because by then, we had all seen with our own eyes exactly what a bite did. And a single bite in that sealed box would have been a death sentence, not just for the bitten, but for the box, for all of us, twice through. 20 people, and not one bite. Carl finally sat back on his heels and told the room, his voice steadier than he could possibly have felt. We're clean, every one of us. Nobody's been touched. And you could feel the whole room let out a breath it had been holding since block 114, a long, shaky exhale that moved through the place like a draft. Heath, the director, appointed himself in charge within the first hour. I have thought a great deal about that kind of man in the time since. You meet one in every disaster, the man whose authority in ordinary life has made him certain that the authority transfers intact into the new world, that the org chart still runs, even when the org is dead and rotting in the seats above your head. He wanted an inventory, a roster, a clear chain of command. None of those were bad ideas in themselves. The way he went about them was the problem. He counted the water out loud, in liters for the whole room to hear, and announced a rationing plan before a single person had said they were thirsty, which set a tone of scarcity and fear in a room of people whose nerves were already scraped down to the wire. He counted the food, which was almost nothing. A steel locker holding a few packets of emergency biscuits, hard as roof slates and tasting of damp cardboard. A strip of water purification tablets we didn't even need because the tank was sealed. A basic first aid kit Carl had already half emptied, checking us for bites. and a box of chemical glow sticks. That was the entire larder. A bunker is built to keep you alive for days while help arrives from the outside. It is not built for whatever this was turning into, because not one of the engineers who designed it had ever once imagined a world in which the outside simply never sent any help at all. Because there was no outside left out there to send it. Priya let him organize. She was far, far smarter than that. She watched Heath take on all the visible authority, the roster and the rationing and the standing in the middle of the room with his arms folded and his chin up. And she quietly kept the real authority for herself, which was the trust of the people who had stood beside her in the control room and watched her make the hard calls and not flinch. She did not fight him for the title. She did not need the title. She came to me in the second hour, when Heath was fully occupied with his clipboard and his careful roster of survivors. And she crouched down beside me, where I sat with my back against the door, close, so we wouldn't carry. And she asked me the question I had been dreading since the dogs first drove home. "The air," she said, keeping her voice low and level. "How long does it last?" I told her the truth, the whole truth, because she was the one single person in that room who could take the whole truth without it breaking her in half. The air, I said, was the one thing we didn't have to worry about, at least not yet. The scrubber ran off the bunker's own battery bank, a row of sealed lead-acid cells in a steel cabinet beside the air unit, and the battery bank charged off the stadium's emergency generator, which sat 2 levels up in a sealed plant room and held enough diesel for 72 hours under full stadium emergency load. Under bunker load, just the scrubber and the LEDs and the little water pump ticking over, that same diesel would last not days, but weeks. The air, I told her, would outlast the food. It would outlast the water. It would, I said, almost certainly outlast our nerves, which got the very ghost of a smile out of her, there and gone. "And if the generator stops?" she asked. She didn't ask it like a frightened person asks. She asked it like a safety officer mapping the failure modes, walking the chain link by link, looking for the single point where the whole thing comes undone in your hands. "Then the battery gives us about 30 hours on its own," I said. "Full charge down to flat, running just the scrubber and the lights. After that, the scrubber stops dead, and the air starts to turn, the carbon dioxide climbs. And within a few hours of that, we have a hard choice, open the door or not. There's no other air down here. The whole design assumes the generator keeps running, or that the air outside is breathable when you finally come up. Right now we've got neither one guaranteed." She held my eyes for a second longer than was comfortable, the red light flattening her face into something carved. And then she nodded once, just once, and stood and went back into the main room. And I understood in that moment that she had just confirmed for herself the exact same thing I had already worked out and didn't want to say first, which was that our entire survival came down to a single generator running unattended in a room full of the dead, 2 floors above our heads, with no one watching it and no one able to reach it without opening the door. And the day that generator coughed, we would have a hard countdown bolted to the wall, ticking down toward a choice that nobody in that room wanted to be the one to make. That was the first night, if you can even call it night, 6 feet under a stadium with no sky left to tell the hour by. I didn't sleep. I sat with my back against the cold steel of the door, and I listened, because you could hear them through it if you pressed your ear flat to the metal. And I pressed my ear to the metal more than once over those hours. Not voices. They never made voices, not the whole time I knew them. A sort of dragging, a soft, persistent scrape of something heavy being pulled across rough concrete. and now and then a single dull impact, a body falling against the door from the stairwell side, a low boom that traveled through the steel and into the bone of my skull, and then a long nothing, and then another. They weren't trying to get in. They didn't know we were there at all. They were just moving in the dark above us, the way water moves, with no will and no plan, finding the low places and settling into them. And the foundation stairwell was the lowest place in that whole corner of the building. And so they collected there and pressed against the door with no intent whatsoever. Just dead weight and gravity and the slow, patient accumulation of bodies in a basin. And the door held, because the door had been built to hold against far worse than the weight of the dead. Around 3 a.m, by my watch, in the part of the night where everyone else had finally slipped down into the thin, twitching, exhausted sleep of the terrified, the man in the steward's vest came and sat down next to me against the door. I hadn't spoken to him yet. Nobody had, not really. In the chaos of getting 19 people down a stairwell in the dark, a man in a high-visibility vest reads instantly, automatically, as staff, as belonging, as someone whose presence in the group requires no explanation from anyone. Nobody questions the one who looks like he is supposed to be there. That is the entire function of the vest, I came to understand. But I had counted 20 and remembered 19. And that one body discrepancy had been sitting in my chest all evening like a swallowed stone, cold and hard and stubbornly refusing to dissolve, no matter how many reasonable explanations I poured on top of it. He introduced himself as Marcus. He had a low, even voice, easy to listen to, the kind of voice that makes you want to agree with whatever it's saying. He said he'd been working the away end, Block 114, and he said it as casually as a man mentions which floor of an office he works on. And I felt every hair on my forearms lift at once, because Block 114 was the block where the first 3 collapsed, the epicenter, the place the whole wave had started, and a living steward in Block 114 should not have been able to walk out of that clean and calm and smiling a half-beat too late. I asked him, keeping my own voice as flat and tired as I could make it, how he had gotten down to us. He said he'd followed the noise. He'd been moving through the service corridors looking for any way out, he said. And he'd heard our group ahead of him in the dark and fallen in quietly behind us, at the very back. And nobody had looked back, because nobody looks back when they are running for their lives. It was plausible. That is the thing about Marcus I need you to hold on to through every single thing that follows. Everything he said was plausible. A steward could have survived Block 114 if he had been right at the outer edge of the block and run the very instant it began. He could have come down behind us in the dark of the service corridors, unseen. People genuinely do fall in with a moving group in a blind panic, like sheep finding any flock at all. There was no single hard fact I could put my finger on and say out loud, that is a lie. There was only the air unit telling me 20, and my own careful triple count telling me 19, and a smile that arrived a half-second after the rest of his face had already decided to make it. I told myself I was exhausted and frightened and turning paranoid, and that the dark and the red light were doing what the dark always does to a tired and frightened mind. I told myself that a man is not a threat simply because he had the luck or the speed to survive when others didn't. I let it go, and that was the first mistake, the small one, the quiet one that made every larger mistake afterward possible. And I've had a great deal of time since to turn over the cold question of whether that small letting go was the mistake that killed the ones we lost. If you had been sitting where I was sitting, your spine pressed against 8 inches of steel with 40,000 of them collecting on the far side of it, and a stranger you could not quite account for lowered himself down beside you in the red dark and smiled at you a half-beat too late, would you have said something? Would you have raised it with Priya, pulled her aside in the corner, named the cold thing turning over in your chest? Or would you have done exactly what I did, told yourself it was nothing but the tiredness and let it win? I genuinely do not know the right answer even now, all this time later. And I've turned it over more nights than I could count for you. The second day, the food and the water stopped being numbers on Heath's clipboard and became real things, felt in the body. Heath's rationing, which had seemed absurd and self-important on the first day, started to make a grim and undeniable kind of sense by the afternoon of the second. 20 people, 3,000 liters of water. Sounds like an ocean until you actually sit down and do the arithmetic. And remember that the chemical toilet needs water to flush, or the whole sealed box turns unlivable inside a day. And that the children needed more than the adults could stand to deny them. And that a human body fails completely without water in a matter of days, not weeks. The biscuits became a kind of bitter joke we didn't bother making out loud. We split a single packet between 4 people and called it a meal, and chewed the hard cardboard-tasting bricks slowly, deliberately, to make them last and to give our mouths something to do. Hunger we could survive for a long time. I knew that much from the dull ache already starting under my own ribs. The body is generous and patient with hunger. Thirst was the real clock, the one quietly ticking down toward the day we would have to open the door for water if nothing else changed first. And then, in the early afternoon of the second day, the radio happened. Priya's security team carried the stadium safety radios, the high-powered digital handsets, far better sets than my battered old facilities unit. And one of them, a young officer named Tobias, no older than 25, with a nervous habit of cracking his knuckles one at a time when the silence stretched, had been quietly scanning the channels since the moment we got down there. Mostly he got static. The long dead hiss of empty frequencies, and now and then an automated emergency broadcast. A flat, synthetic voice, telling people to remain inside their homes and await further instruction. A sentence that meant precisely nothing to 19 people sealed under a stadium full of the dead. But on the afternoon of the second day, on a frequency that wasn't a stadium channel and wasn't a standard emergency band either. Somewhere out in the gaps where there should have been nothing at all. Tobias picked up a voice. He sat up straight on the bunk and threw up one hand for quiet. And the whole room went still at once. 20 people holding their breath around one small black handset. It was a man. He was calm, and he was clear. And the signal was strong, no static crackling under it at all. Which I noticed and filed away without yet understanding why it would matter so much. He said he was broadcasting from a coordinated shelter at the city's water treatment works, 4 miles to the north, and that they had power, clean running water, secure walls, and that they were accepting any survivors who could safely reach them. He gave a route, street by street, naming the turns, and then a set of recognition signals to use on the final approach. And then he repeated the whole thing, every word, on a loop, every few minutes. The same calm voice with the same instructions, in the same order. And the effect of that voice on a room full of frightened, thirsty people, who had been listening to nothing but dead static and the dragging of the dead through 8 inches of steel, was like watching a row of plants turn their leaves toward the sun. You could see it move through their bodies, the way they leaned in toward the little handset, the way the father pulled both his children a little closer to him, as if the voice itself might somehow reach out and gather them up and carry them somewhere with the lights on. Heath wanted to go. Of course he did. A man like Heath cannot survive long in a hole in the ground. He needs a destination, a plan, a thing to march people towards so that he can be the one out front doing the marching. He stood up off his bunk and started talking about routes and timing and how the treatment works was reachable on foot if we moved at night, when the dead were, he claimed, slower. Though not one of us actually knew that they were slower at night. It was simply a thing that felt true in the saying of it. He had half a route built in his head before the looping voice had even finished its second pass. Priya was more careful. She let him talk himself most of the way out, and then she asked the questions a careful person asks, laying them down one at a time and flat on the table like cards. How did we actually know the broadcast was real and current, and not a recording someone had set running and then died beside, or walked away from days ago? How exactly did we move 20 people, 3 of them small children, one of them a catering worker who'd torn something in her knee coming down the stairs and could barely put weight on it, 4 miles across a city full of the things upstairs? And what did we do? She asked, looking around the red room slowly. If the bunker, the thing that was actually, demonstrably, right now, this minute, keeping every one of us alive, turned out to be the single safest place left in the whole city, and we walked away from it for a voice. I sided with Priya, and I want to be honest with you about why, because the why matters far more than the side. It was not pure caution or pure wisdom, and I won't let myself pretend it was. It was the bunker. I knew that bunker. I had maintained it with my own 2 hands for 11 years. I trusted the steel in the seal and the scrubbed cool air the way you trust a thing you understand, all the way down to its bones. A thing whose every weld and gasket you have personally inspected. The waterworks was a voice on a radio. A thing I could only hear, never touch, never test. The bunker was 8 inches of certainty I could lay the flat of my hand against and feel hold steady under the pressure of the dead. And I've always, my entire life, every time the two were set against each other, chosen the certainty I can touch over the hope I can only hear. It is what makes a man a good engineer. It turned out to be a dangerous blind spot in a man trying to keep 20 people alive. Because the one thing about a blind spot is that you cannot see it. That's the whole meaning of the word. It sits exactly where your eyes don't go. The argument split the room. Not loudly, not all at once. But you could feel the fault line crack open and run right down the middle of those 20 people, between the ones who wanted to move and the ones who wanted to stay. And it ran in a way that had almost nothing to do with logic and almost everything to do with hope, which is a stronger and more dangerous thing than logic ever was. The children's father wanted to move more than anyone in that room, more than Heath even, because his wife was somewhere out there beyond the door, alive or dead, and moving meant the chance, however thin, of finding her again, while staying meant sitting still in the dark, and slowly, day by day, accepting that she was gone for good. I understood that all the way down to the floor of me. I have never blamed him for a single thing he did, before or after, not once. And through all of it, Marcus said nothing. He sat at the back near the lip of the water tank, in the deepest part of the red shadow where the light barely reached, and he listened, his head tilted very slightly, taking it all in the way a man takes in information he fully intends to use later. And once, when Tobias turned up the volume, so that the whole room could hear the looping broadcast clearly, I happened to be looking directly at Marcus, and I saw his lips move, just slightly, and for one cold second, when I had the absolutely unmistakable impression that he was mouthing the words a half-beat before the radio said them, the way you mouth along to a song you have heard 1,000 times, the way your lips already know the next line before the speaker reaches it. I told myself I had imagined it. The light was bad, the deep red flattening every shadow into every other shadow. The distance across the room was far. His face half turned away, but I shifted my position after that, just slightly, an inch at a time, so it wouldn't draw attention, until I was sitting where I could see both Marcus and the handset at the same time. And from that point on, I stopped listening to the voice on the Waterworks channel as a survivor hoping desperately for rescue. And I started listening to it the only other way I know how to listen to anything. The way I listen to a system that is behaving strangely, as an engineer hunting a fault. Here is what I found. And it took me most of the third day to be truly certain of it. The loop was exactly the same every single time. Not similar, identical. The same pauses, the same audible intake of breath before the third sentence. The same tiny catch on the first syllable of the word treatment. A little hitch in the voice, as if the man speaking had a dry throat right at that one word, every time. A living man. Even a man reading carefully from a written script varies. He clears his throat between takes. He speeds up when he gets tired and the hour gets late and he wants his bed, and slows down when he's making sure a frightened listener catches a difficult street name. This voice never once varied. Not by a single syllable. Not by a measurable fraction of a second. I timed 2 consecutive loops against the sweep hand of my watch, holding my breath to keep still. And they were identical right down to the limit of what I could measure with a wristwatch in the dark. It was a recording, which by itself meant nothing damning. Because a real shelter full of real people might well loop a recording to spare a man's voice and free up his hands for the 100 urgent jobs of keeping a shelter running. But a recording told us absolutely nothing about whether a single living person still stood behind it. And a room full of thirsty, frightened, hoping people was getting ready to walk 20 bodies 4 miles across a city of the dead on the strength of a tape that might have been playing to an empty concrete room, or worse, for days on end. I told Priya first, quietly, by the water tank, with my back turned to the room so my face couldn't be read. I told her the voice was a loop, a recording, and that we therefore had no way at all of knowing whether one single living person stood behind it. And she listened, her arms folded across her chest, her eyes steady on my face the whole time. And then she did the thing that made me trust her more than anyone I've ever worked beside in my entire life. She did not immediately pick the information up and turn it into a weapon to win the argument she was already quietly winning. She thought about it first. I watched her think, the small movements behind her eyes as she turned it over. And then she said something I have not been able to set down since. "If it's a loop," she said, her voice barely above the steady hum of the air unit, "then either someone set it up and then died, or someone set it up and is still alive, or—" And here she dropped her voice lower still, so low that the room could not have caught a word of it, even if they'd been straining. Someone set it up specifically to gather people into one place. And I keep coming back over and over to which of those 3 options puts the most warm, healthy, living bodies into one single building. I had been so completely fixated on the simple binary of whether the shelter was real or not real that I had never once considered the third thing, that it might be a trap, and not a trap set by the dead. Because the dead do not set traps. The dead do not broadcast on clean, strong frequencies, in calm, even voices with carefully chosen recognition signals and a route mapped street by street. A trap set by the living, for the living. And the instant she said it out loud, my mind went, entirely against my own will, straight to Marcus, to the man who had arrived as the 20th body in a count of 19. To the lips that had moved a half beat ahead of the recording, to a steward from block 114, ground zero. the very place the wave began, who had strolled out of the first outbreak in the building without so much as a torn sleeve or a smear on that lemon-yellow vest. I didn't have a theory yet. I had a feeling, and a feeling is not a thing you can act on with 20 frightened people watching, and one of them quite possibly something other than frightened. But from that moment on, I started watching Marcus the way I would watch a pressure gauge I knew was reading wrong. Steadily, patiently, without ever letting him see me do it. Waiting for the moment the needle finally moved far enough that no one in the room could argue it away. It moved on the night of the third day. And when it moved, everything I thought I understood about the bunker turned over like a ship rolling its keel up to the sky. It started, of all things, with the generator. I had been listening to it the whole time without ever knowing I was listening. The way you hear your own heartbeat, without ever once consciously counting it. It ran 2 levels up in its sealed plant room. A steady, low mechanical hum that carried down through the concrete and steel of the building and into the bunker walls. So constant and so low that within an hour you stopped hearing it as a sound at all, and started hearing it only as the absence of worry. A kind of mechanical lullaby that murmured over and over, "The air is fine, the air is fine, the air is fine." On the third night, sometime around 2 in the morning by my watch, the hum changed. It stuttered, caught, ran rough for 3 or 4 seconds, a coughing, hunting, uneven note, and then steadied again, but rougher than before, with a new low vibration buried down inside it that I felt come up through the concrete floor and into my spine before my ears had fully finished registering the change in the sound. I knew that vibration. I knew it the way I knew the air unit's voice. Fuel starvation. The generator was beginning to draw from the very bottom of its day tank, pulling up the water and the fine sediment that always collect at the lowest point of any diesel store no matter how clean you keep it. And that rough hunting run was the sound of an engine starting to choke on dirty fuel, the sound of a machine starting to die. I had told Priya weeks of fuel under bunker load. I'd been exactly right about the arithmetic, and completely wrong about the machine. And the gap between those 2 things was about to very nearly kill all of us. Because the fault I had come in early on Saturday morning to fix, that under-soil heating fault, had been quietly drawing extra load off that same generator all through the lockdown, every hour of every one of those 3 days and nights. And the tank that should have lasted weeks under pure bunker load had been bleeding down far, far faster than my clean, confident arithmetic had ever allowed for. I got up without a word and went to the air unit's small control panel, a dim green readout behind a steel door. And I checked the battery bank charge, and the number sat at 61%. And as I stood there watching it for a full minute, counting my own breaths, it ticked down to 60, because the generator was no longer charging the bank faster than the scrubber was draining it. The lullaby had quietly become an alarm clock. I did the arithmetic 3 times standing there in the green glow, the way I always do when the answer matters, because an answer that important needs to survive being checked twice over. 60%. 30 hours of scrubber time from a full bank, so call it 18 hours of clean air left in the room, give or take an hour. And then the scrubber stops dead, and the carbon dioxide starts its slow climb. And then we either open the door into a stairwell packed solid with the dead, or we don't open it, and we slowly, gently suffocate. 20 people, 3 of them children, growing drowsy in the thickening air, and lying down, and not waking up. The countdown I had described to Priya on the first night as a distant, theoretical, almost academic possibility, was now a live clock bolted to the wall of the room. And it had 18 hours showing on it. I woke Priya, I did not wake the room. I crouched by her bunk and laid a hand on her shoulder. And she came awake instantly, fully, all at once, the way people who have done emergencies their whole working lives come awake. No grogginess at all. Straight up out of sleep and into readiness, her eyes already finding mine in the dark. The two of us stood together by the air panel in the dim green and red light. And I showed her the falling number. And I watched her absorb it the way she absorbed everything. Fast and clean and without a flicker of drama. Her jaw tightening by a fraction. And then she asked the only question that actually mattered. "Can you get to the generator and refuel it?" The fuel store was up in the plant room, 2 levels above us, on the far side of the building from the bunker stairwell. To reach it, I would have to open the bunker door, climb the foundation stairwell where the dead had been collecting for 3 days, cross an open stretch of the lower concourse, get into the plant room, and lock it behind me. Find the spare fuel drums I knew were stacked against the far wall there for exactly this kind of failure. Get diesel out of the drums and into the generator's day tank. And then make the whole journey back down and reseal the door and do every single step of it without once being touched by anything in the dark. It was possible. I ran the whole route in my head, step by step, door to door, and it was possible. It was barely possible. It was the precise flavor of barely possible that gets a careful man killed. And while Priya and I stood there working it out, in low voices, whether I could actually do it and how long it would take, I became slowly aware that we were not the only 2 people in that room who were awake. Marcus was sitting up on his bunk at the back, in the deepest of the red shadow, watching us. And from the absolute stillness of him, from the way his eyes were already adjusted and already fixed on the 2 of us, I understood that he had been awake and watching for some time. That the change in the generator's note had woken him too, or more likely, that he had never been asleep at all. When he saw me notice him, he stood, unhurried, no stiffness in him after 3 days on a steel bunk, and he crossed the room toward us with that smooth, economical, faintly wrong way of moving that I had been quietly cataloging for 3 days. No wasted motion in it anywhere. No stumble in the dark, even though the floor was cluttered with sleeping people. And he said in a low voice pitched carefully not to wake the others, "I'll go with him. 2 move faster than 1. And 2 can carry more fuel down in a single trip." And Priya, who trusted almost no one easily, who had built an entire long career out of not trusting people easily, looked at this man she barely knew offering to walk up into the dark with me to keep the rest of them breathing, and I watched her weigh it on the cold scales of survival. And I willed her with every fiber I had to say, no, send him back to his bunk. Because every instinct I'd been forcing down hard for 3 days straight was standing up all at once and screaming that the very last thing on this earth I wanted at my back in a black stairwell full of the dead was Marcus. But here is the terrible logic of survival. The thing that people who have never been truly hungry and never once been cornered never have to learn. I needed the help. 2 pairs of hands could move 200-liter drums in a third of the time 1 pair could. And the faster the refueling went, the less time the bunker door stood open and unsealed. And the safer every single person sleeping in that room behind us was. Every rational argument on the board said, take the help. Only my feeling said no. And a feeling is not a number. And I was a man who, every single time, the 2 disagreed across a whole lifetime, had sided with the number. If you were standing exactly where I was standing, 18 hours of clean air ticking down on the wall, a job that absolutely had to be done in the dark and had to be done fast, and the only person in the room on his feet and volunteering to share the risk was the one single person you did not trust. Would you have taken him with you to move faster and keep the door open for less time? Or would you have gone alone and slower, up into a stairwell packed with the dead, just to keep him where you could see his hands? Because I made my choice that night. And I've spent every day since wondering whether the other one would have brought more of us out the far end alive. I said yes. God help me, I said yes. Because the numbers said yes, and the numbers were my mother tongue. I told myself that whatever Marcus was, steward or liar or something else entirely, he plainly, obviously wanted to live. And a man who wants to live will help you keep a generator running, because the generator is keeping him alive too. I told myself I could watch him the whole time, every second, never let him get behind me. I told myself a great many useful things in the 4 or 5 minutes it took the two of us to get ready. And every single one of them was the kind of thing a man tells himself after he has already decided to do the dangerous thing, and only needs his own mind to sign off on the decision he has already made. We woke Tobias to work the door behind us, because the wheel could be turned from the inside to crack the door, and turned again to reseal it. And we needed someone we trusted absolutely on that wheel. Someone who would not panic at a sound in the stairwell and would not open it for the wrong knock. We took 2 flashlights, and I made Tobias and Priya watch me check the batteries on both, thumbing the switches, the white beams almost shocking, almost violent. After 3 days of nothing but red, I took a crowbar from the small tool locker, heavy and cold and solid in my hand, and a coil of rope I slung across my body over one shoulder. I took my full ring of keys, and I separated out the plant room key and the fuel store key, and held the 2 of them ready in my closed fist, so that I wouldn't be standing in the dark, fumbling through a ring of 40 keys with a thing coming toward me. Priya took my free hand for a second before I went, just held it, dry and warm and steady. And she said, 18 hours. If you're not back inside 6, we plan for the door. She meant that they would plan to abandon me, to keep the steel sealed against the dead, even if it meant leaving me out there on the wrong side of it to die. And she was completely right to mean it. And I loved her a little in that moment, in a way that had nothing whatsoever to do with romance and everything to do with respect, for being honest enough to say it straight to my face, instead of letting me believe a comforting lie. Tobias put both hands on the wheel and spun it. The 4 dogs drew back, thunk, 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 the same sound running in reverse, and the door cracked open, and the smell came in before the gap was even wide enough to put a shoulder through. A solid wall of it, copper and rot, and the thick, particular, clinging sweetness of bodies left for 3 days in a warm, sealed, unventilated building, a smell I will never get out of the very back of my throat as long as I live. And I heard the dragging start up in the dark above us, the soft scrape and shift, the sound of things registering, dimly, in whatever was left inside their skulls. That something in their black, still world had just changed. We went up. I led, because I knew the stairwell, and Marcus, for all his easy confidence, did not. Our 2 flashlight beams cut narrow white tunnels through a darkness that was full of shapes propped against the walls, their slumped figures, some of them moving slowly, swaying on the spot, some of them not moving at all. And the rule I had pieced together over 3 nights of listening through the door, the rule that held my whole life in it now, was simple. They were slow and aimless and harmless until they fixed on you. And the very instant they fixed, they came hard and fast and did not stop. And so the entire trick, the only trick, was to be quiet, to be fast, to keep the beams low and off their faces, and to never, ever, under any circumstances, let one of them fix on you. We went up the first flight, stepping carefully over the things that didn't stir, giving the widest possible berth to the things that did. Our breathing loud in our own ears, no matter how we tried to soften it. And then out along the lower concourse with its dead, dark vending machines, and its scattered dropped scarves, and its spilled drinks gone 3 days sticky on the floor. And Marcus moved beside me, with a competence that should have reassured me, and instead frightened me, far more than anything in the dark. He moved like a man who had done exactly this thing before, and more than once. He knew, without being told, without me showing him, precisely how close was too close to one of them. He never once made the mistake a frightened amateur makes, never swung his beam wide in a flinch of panic, never caught his foot on the debris, never let his breathing climb up into his throat. He flowed through that stairwell of the dead like it was a thing he had trained for in some quiet building somewhere. And an honest steward from Block 114, a man who checked tickets and pointed people toward their seats for a living, should have been as clumsy and loud with raw terror as I was fighting not to be. We reached the plant room. I got the heavy steel door open with the key on the first try, my hand steadier than I had any right to expect, and we got inside, and I pulled the door shut behind us and threw the internal bolt. And for one blessed moment, we had a pocket of real, relative safety. The machine room with its single lockable door and the generator hammering away in the corner, running rough and hot now, the air inside thick with diesel fumes and the dry, radiant heat thrown off the engine block. The spare fuel drums were exactly where I knew they would be. 3 of them lined up against the far wall, 200 liters each. Blue steel with the maker's stencil half worn off. Far more than enough to top off the day tank and buy the bunker, not hours, but days. I got the first drum tipped over onto the pump trolley, ran the transfer hose down into the generator's tank, set the hand pump, and started cranking the lever, stiff at first and then easing as the prime caught and the diesel began to move through the hose with a low gulping sound. And Marcus took up a position by the door, watching the corridor outside through the small square of wired glass set into it. And that is when he started to talk. He talked while I pumped, his voice low and even, and carrying easily under the steady hammer of the engine. And the things he told me rearranged the floor beneath my feet, one plank at a time. He told me he wasn't a steward. The high-visibility vest, he said, was just something he had pulled on in the first 10 minutes of the chaos. Because a man in a high-visibility vest can walk into any room, down any corridor, through any restricted door in any building anywhere on Earth. And no one stops him. No one even thinks to wonder. I kept pumping, kept my eyes on the rising fuel, and my back half turned to him only because the trolley forced it. He told me he had been at the stadium that day, not as staff and not as a fan, but as one of a small team there specifically to observe the away end, Block 114. And when I asked him, my voice carefully flat, what team, he gave me the half-second late smile, and I heard it more than saw it in the dark. And he said a word I will not repeat here, because to this day I am not certain it was true. A word that implied a government, or something wearing the costume and the budget of one. A department that does the work nobody is ever supposed to know got done. He told me the thing in Block 114 had not started there by accident. He said it had been carried in, deliberately, a small controlled release in a dense sealed environment, to measure how a thing like that spreads through a packed crowd, and how fast, and that the stadium's lockdown procedure, the thing Priya had triggered to save us, had been not an unlucky accident of timing, but the entire point of choosing a stadium at all, because a sealed stadium was the perfect sealed test chamber, walls and roof and locked gates, and 41,000 ticket holders were the sample size. He said all of this in that calm, even, almost gentle voice, while I pumped diesel with hands that had gone slowly numb on the lever. And the worst part, the part that sank into me like a fishhook and made me believe him against every single wish I had, was that it explained the timing. 3 simultaneous collapses in 3 separate, widely spaced blocks, all within 90 seconds. Not a spread radiating outward from one point, the way a contagion spreads from a single first case. A release in 3 places at once. A pattern. And patterns, as I've been telling you since the very 3rd stretcher call, are never, ever bad luck. I asked him why he was telling me all this. The pump lever rose and fell under my numb hand. He said it was because the experiment was over and the people who had run it weren't coming back to the stadium. And the broadcast from the waterworks, the calm looping voice, with the clean, strong signal and the dry little catch on the word treatment, was theirs. A gathering signal, a net cast wide. A way to draw the survivors who'd had the wit to hide out of their holes and funnel them, on their own legs, hopeful and grateful, toward a single collection point. He had recognized it for what it was the very first time Tobias tuned it in across the bunker. The voice on the loop, he said, was a colleague of his. He had worked beside the man who recorded it. That was why his lips had moved along with the words. He knew the script by heart, every pause and every breath, because he had heard it recorded in the room. And then he told me the thing that stopped the pump dead in my hands. He told me the people at the waterworks were not running a shelter at all. They were running the next phase, and the next phase needed live, uninfected subjects, healthy bodies that had been exposed to the thing inside a sealed environment for days and had, against all the odds, not turned. Because a person who could sit inside a stadium full of the infected for 3 full days and nights and then walk out clean was exactly the thing they most wanted to get their hands on and take apart to understand. And that, he said, was us. The bunker, 19 clean, healthy, exposed and uninfected bodies, sealed up neat and labeled in a steel box that I had personally maintained and personally signed off as airtight twice a year for 11 years. And Marcus had not fallen in behind us in the dark by accident. He had followed us deliberately, all the way down. He had marked us, the way a man marks a thing he intends to come back and collect. He had been waiting, patiently, calmly, for 3 days, for the one absolutely inevitable moment when the bunker failed, and we had no choice left but to come up out of it into the open. Because a sealed bunker is a problem, and an open bunker is a delivery. I want to be very honest with you about what I felt standing there in the diesel heat and the dark, because it was not the clean cinematic clarity people like to imagine for a moment like that. It was the exact opposite of clarity. It was a sick, swimming, falling vertigo. The floor seeming to drop away from under my boots, the particular vertigo of a man realizing all at once that the safe place was never the safe place. That the 8 inches of steel I had trusted with all our lives had not made us survivors at all, but a sealed, labeled, addressed shipment waiting for collection. And that the generator running out of fuel was not a malfunction at all, but a schedule. Because a man who wants to open a sealed box does not waste his strength trying to break it open from the outside. He simply waits for the box to run out of air. And then the box opens itself, from the inside, gratefully, into his waiting hands. And then I understood the generator all the way down to the bottom. The undersoil heating fault that had drained the day tank so much faster than my clean arithmetic had ever allowed for. I had come in early on Saturday morning to fix a fault that someone had deliberately introduced, on the very system that fed the generator that fed the bunker, so that the air would fail on a chosen schedule, so that we would have no choice in the end but to open the door at a time of their choosing, not ours. I had maintained that bunker for 11 years, And I had walked all 19 of those people down into a trap I had unknowingly helped to build, and then sealed the door behind us with my own 2 hands, and stood there in the red light, feeling something close to pride at how cleanly and well the seal had held. Marcus watched my silhouette in the dark do all of this. Watched the slow horror move through me and change the set of my shoulders. And I heard him make a small sound that was almost a nod, turned audible. The small, satisfied sound of a teacher whose slow student has finally arrived, unaided, at the right answer. And then he told me what came next. He told me he was leaving the stadium that very night, that the plant room had a service exit running down to the loading bay, that the loading bay opened out onto the north side of the building, and that to the north lay 4 miles of dead, silent city, and then the waterworks. And he was going. But he wanted me to come with him, not into the waterworks, but around it, past it, north and out and gone, because I was useful. A man who could read buildings and systems and structures, who could find the way in and the way out of anywhere, was a thing worth keeping alive in the world that was coming. And the rest of the bunker, he said simply, plainly, was not his problem, and it did not need to be mine either. He told me to leave the door sealed, go back down, top off the generator, buy them another full week of clean air, and then, while they all slept in the false comfort of it, slip out quietly with him through the plant room and down through the loading bay, and let the waterworks people find an empty bunker or a starved one whenever they finally came around to collect their delivery. Either way, it was no longer our concern. He framed the whole thing as a kind of mercy. The bunker people were already cargo, he said, already counted, already gone, just slow about it. There was nothing I could do for 19 people that wouldn't simply get me killed alongside them. One more clean body added to the collection. And the only rational move left on the board was to take the knowledge he had given me, free of charge, and use it to keep myself breathing in the world that was actually coming. And the true horror of it, the deepest part, the part that nearly worked, was that the numbers agreed with him completely. I was a man who trusted numbers above all things, and the numbers here were brutally unambiguous. One man with information survives where 20 people in a hole do not. Every rational argument I had used just an hour before to justify bringing him up here with me on this trip had quietly inverted in the dark and become an argument for abandoning every soul behind that door. He had built the logic the same way I would have built it, the same way I built everything in my life, brick by brick, certainty stacked carefully on top of certainty. And at the far end of his clean, reasonable, well-constructed argument stood a steel door I was supposed to walk away from and leave sealed forever. I finished the first drum. I swapped the hose over to the second and started cranking again. Slower now, deliberately slower, buying myself a little more time to think inside the noise of the engine. And while I pumped, I did the one single thing I should have done on the very first night sitting against that door, with the stone in my chest. I stopped trusting the numbers, and I started trusting the feeling, because the feeling had been right the entire time, from the first half-tone rise of the fan, and the numbers had been the lie all along. The numbers had counted 19 when there were 20. The numbers had walked us all neatly into the box and sealed it. The numbers were Marcus's native language, and he spoke it more fluently than I ever had. And he was using it on me right now, here in the dark, the exact same way the looping voice had used hope on a room full of thirsty people, by handing you a clean, reasonable, well-lit path, and trusting that you would be far too tired and too frightened to stop and ask where the path actually led. So I made myself think instead about the things the numbers could never hold, never weigh, never get up onto the board at all. The two children, asleep on a folded steel bunk. The girl's small hand still curled tight in the fabric of her brother's sleeve, even in sleep. The father who still let himself believe, against everything, that his wife might be alive. Somewhere out there in the dark city. Priya, who had taken my dry hand in her own and told me the honest, brutal truth about the 6 hours and the door without once softening it, who trusted no one and had, against every hard-won instinct she owned, trusted Marcus tonight only because I had said yes. Carl, who could not fix one single thing that was actually wrong with our situation, but had checked every one of us twice for bites anyway, because if he could not help us, he could at least know. And knowing was its own small kind of care. Ferdy, who had survived a whole stadium full of the dead by locking himself in a mower store and breathing engine fumes and dumb luck. 19 people who were alive at that exact moment because 8 inches of steel had held, and who would stay alive past this night only if the one man who knew the building chose them over himself. In the dark, in a plant room that stank of diesel. I made my choice while the second drum slowly drained down. I am not going to dress it up for you as courage, because it did not feel anything at all like courage in the moment. It felt like the only thing I could go on living with afterward, which is a different thing entirely, and I have come to believe in all the time since. A far more reliable engine than courage. Because courage burns out fast, and what you can live with does not. I decided that Marcus was not going to walk out of that plant room a free man, that the knowledge he had handed me was going back down to the bunker where it could do some actual good. And that the door was going to open again, yes, but on our schedule and our terms, not the waterworks. The trouble was purely practical, and I'm a practical man. So I held it out at arm's length and looked at it cleanly, the way I'd look at any problem. Marcus was stronger than me, faster than me, and he had spent the last hour proving to me, beyond any doubt, that he moved through the dark and the dead like he owned the both of them. I could not fight him. I would lose badly and quickly. And losing meant he simply walked out into the night. And the whole thing played out exactly as he had planned it. Only now, without me down there, to change a single part of it. So I was not going to fight him. I was going to use the one single thing I had that he did not. Which was that I knew that room, every wire and panel and breaker and circuit in it, down to the labels I had written in my own hand, and he only thought he did. The plant room service exit, the one running down to the loading bay, the one he intended to leave by, was a roller shutter with a smaller man door set into the body of it. And that man door's electric release ran off the same sub-panel I had personally rewired 2 summers earlier during an upgrade. A sub-panel whose every single breaker I had labeled myself with a marker pen. The big roller shutter had a safety system, a motion sensor mounted at about waist height inside the bay, whose only job was to stop the shutter coming down on a delivery van or a person standing underneath it. And the loading bay beyond that man door, I knew with a cold and total certainty, was not empty. The loading bay was where the catering and the kit deliveries came in, half sunk below ground level so the lorries could back right up to the dock, and on a sold-out cup tie Saturday afternoon, it had been full of staff when the lockdown clamped down across the whole building. And on our way down through the guts of the place 3 days earlier, I had heard, unmistakably, the sound of a great many things moving together in the dark below the lower concourse in exactly that direction. The dead find the low places. The loading bay, sunk below ground for the lorries, was the lowest place on that whole side of the building, the very bottom of the basin. Marcus thought the loading bay was his clean, quiet exit to the north. I knew it was the sump the dead had been pooling down into for 3 days straight, behind a door he fully intended to open with his own hand. I told him I would come with him. I made my voice flat and tired and beaten, the voice of a man who has run the numbers one last time, and finally, reluctantly, accepted the answer they gave him. And he believed it instantly and completely, because it was the exact voice he had been waiting and expecting to hear. The voice of a man like himself, finally seeing sense and choosing to live. I finished the second drum and left the third one standing untouched for the bunker. I told him I needed to do one thing first: top off the generator properly so that the building's emergency lighting circuit would hold long enough for the two of us to find our way out cleanly, because moving through a loading bay in absolute pitch dark would be plain suicide for both of us, and we would want the bay's emergency lights up to see our footing by. He agreed without a second's hesitation. It was a sensible thing for a sensible man to want, and Marcus dealt only in sensible. I went to the sub-panel, the one I had rewired, the one I knew like the lines worn into my own palms. And I did not top off the emergency lighting circuit. I did the precise and exact opposite. I isolated the loading bay's lighting circuit entirely, killed it dead, and I isolated the roller shutter's motion sensor safety system, the circuit whose only purpose in the world was to stop that big door operating onto an obstruction. And then I patched the man door's electric release through to the very switch I was about to place in his hand, so that when Marcus pressed it to let himself out into the night, he would open that door in total, absolute, lightless dark, with every last safety stripped out of the circuit behind it, into a half-sunk concrete bay packed wall to wall and floor to ceiling with the things that had been pooling down toward the warmth and the smell of the living for 3 days and 3 nights without a pause. Then I handed him the keys to the service exit and told him I would be right behind him, that I just had to wrestle the last drum onto the trolley for the bunker run before I followed. And Marcus, who had spent 3 full days reading every single one of us correctly, flawlessly, who had built a logic so clean and so reasonable that I had very nearly walked straight into the dead center of it, made the one and only mistake that a man like him is built to make. He believed that I was, underneath everything, exactly as purely and coldly rational as he was. That I had quietly done the same sum he had done, and arrived at the same final answer. He turned his back on me. He crossed to the man door in the dark, and he keyed it open. I won't describe what came through that door. I will only tell you that the loading bay had not been empty for 3 days, and that the things pooled down in it had been pressing toward that door the whole time, the way they pressed toward every door in the building, drawn by nothing more than warmth and the dim animal memory of where the living go, and that Marcus had just barely enough time to understand exactly what I had done to him. Because the bay's emergency light flickered once, a single dying stutter as the surge of bodies broke through and dragged the circuit down for good. And in that 1/2 second of failing yellow light, I saw his face turn back toward me across the room, and the smile arrived a half-beat late the way it always had, even now, even here. And then the light was gone, and so was the half-second. And so, very quickly and very completely, was Marcus. I was already moving before the dark fully closed over the room. I had the plant room's inner door open and the 3rd drum loaded on the trolley ahead of me. And I was through it, and I hauled it shut and threw the bolt against the sound. And the sound coming through that door was the worst thing I have ever heard in my life. And I have heard a great many bad things since. Then I was running the trolley back down the dark concourse toward the stairwell. 1 fuel drum and 1 flashlight, and the entire crushing weight of knowing what we actually were. And behind me, the things that had come boiling up out of the loading bay were spreading out into the lower levels of the building, drawn away by the open door and the broken, flickering light. Away by luck, or by my design, or by some mix of the two, I will never be able to untangle, from the bunker stairwell. I got to the door. I gave Tobias the knock we had agreed before I left. 3 slow, 2 fast, my closed fist on the cold steel. And I heard the wheel begin to turn from the inside, and the 4 dogs drew back, and I half fell through the gap into the deep red light and the clean, cool, scrubbed air. And I put both my own hands on the wheel and spun it and drove the dogs home. Thunk, 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 thunk. And then I put my back flat against the steel and slid down it until I was sitting on the cold floor, the crowbar still gripped in one hand, the 3rd drum abandoned in the corridor behind Tobias, who was already wrestling it inside through the gap. Priya crouched down in front of me, her face close in the red light, and she asked me where Marcus was. And I looked up at her, and for a long moment, I genuinely could not make the words form. And then I said the only true thing I had left in me. He's not coming, and we have to leave. Not tonight, but soon, and not toward the waterworks. The waterworks is the trap. The bunker was the trap. All of it, every part of it, was the trap. I told them everything. I owed them that, every word of it, and I gave it to them sitting on the floor with my back against the door, while the 3rd drum's diesel was fed into the generator, and the battery readout slowly began to climb back up out of the red. I told them about the controlled release in Block 114, and the lockdown that was the whole entire point of it, and the looping voice that was a net, and the generator fault that was a clock someone had quietly set for us. I told them that I had helped build the trap without knowing it, that I had come in early on a Saturday morning to fix a fault that someone had set on purpose so that the air would fail on a schedule. And I told them what I had done to Marcus. All of it. The dark and the bay and the bypassed safety and the one flickering light. And I watched their faces in the red glow, and I waited for the judgment to come, braced flat against the steel for it. And the judgment did not come. It did not come because Priya had been exactly right on the very first night when she said that survival has a cost. And every single one of them had already paid pieces of that cost on the way down those stairs. And they understood, without my ever having to say it out loud, that I had paid mine up there in the plant room and carried the change back down to lay at their feet. We had a full generator now, the day tank topped off and the battery climbing steadily, weeks of clean air back on the clock above our heads. And the dead had been drawn off the stairwell, away toward the loading bay and the broken light. We had time. Not safety, because I had learned the hard way in one night that there is no such thing as safety, only steel that does a very convincing impression of it. But time, which was the only real currency there ever was down in that hole. And we had the truth, which was worth more than all 8 inches of steel put together, because the steel had been a lie that called itself a shelter. And the truth was that we now had to leave the safest place than any of us had ever stood inside, precisely and exactly because the people who built the trap knew where the box was and were coming, eventually, to collect it. Here is where I will leave the part of the story that is clean enough to tell. We planned for 11 days. I am not going to pretend it was simple or quick, or that every one of us made it out the far side, because we didn't. And I will not cheapen the ones we lost by hurrying past them as though they were a line in a ledger to be totaled and closed. The catering worker with the torn knee could not make the climb in the end, could not move fast enough through the dark to be anything but a danger to the rest. And she knew it before any of us were willing to say it. And she made her own peace with staying behind. And I will not say more than that, because it is hers and not mine to tell. Ferdy went back up for the radio on the 9th day because Priya wanted to know whether the looping voice ever changed, ever broke its pattern. And he didn't come back down again. And we sealed the door on the sound of him, the same way Priya had sealed the control room door on the sponsor. And she held my hand while we both did it, the two of us standing there with our hands on the wheel. And neither one of us pretended for a single second that it was anything other than exactly what it was. But the children made it. The father carried the youngest, the girl, on his back the whole entire way north, all 4 miles of it, not toward the waterworks, but in a wide, careful, patient arc around it, through a dead and silent city under a cold gray sky. And when we passed within distant sight of the treatment works, we saw the lights still burning on inside the fences and the gate standing wide open. And the same calm voice still rolling out across the dark water now on an actual loudspeaker, no longer a radio, inviting the survivors in, warm and patient, and never once changing the dry little catch on the word treatment. And we did not go in. That was the single hardest thing I've ever done, harder than the door, harder than Marcus. To walk a thin line of frightened, exhausted, thirsty people past an open gate with warm light spilling out of it onto the road, and lead them instead the other way, into the cold and the dark, on nothing more than the word of a man who had very nearly chosen to abandon every one of them 3 nights before. If you have stayed with me all the way to here, I would genuinely like to know, and I mean that, not as a thing you say at the end of a story to fill the silence. Would you have trusted me, standing in that field in the dark, leading you away from the only lights for miles and back into the black? Because not all of them trusted me. And the ones who broke away from us there and walked toward the loudspeaker, toward the warm light and the open gate, I think about them more than I think about any of the rest. More than Ferdy. More than the woman with the knee. More, God forgive me, than I think about Marcus. We are somewhere north now. I won't tell you where, and not because I don't trust you, but because the bunker taught me the one single lesson I will hold on to until the day I die, which is that a sealed location is only ever exactly as safe as the intentions of the people who know where it is. So we don't seal ourselves into anything anymore, ever. We don't sleep in a place we can't leave by more than one door. And we never, under any circumstances, no matter how thirsty we are, no matter how warm it sounds, walk toward a voice that doesn't change. The grass under that stadium is probably still green, growing long and wild now through the cracks in the terracing, fed by the rain that gets in where the roof has started to fail with no one left to fix it. 40,000 seats. I think about the steward's vest most of all. That lemon yellow, high visibility yellow with the silver bands across the chest. The way a man can pull on the simple costume of belonging and walk straight into any building, any room, any group of frightened people running through the dark. And no one ever looks back at him, because no one ever looks back when they're running. Look back. That is the only thing I learned down there that's truly worth handing to anyone else. When the worst has finally happened, and you are moving through the dark with people you have decided to trust, count them, then count them again. And when the count comes out 1 too high, when the air itself is telling you 20 and your own careful, stubborn memory swears blind that it was 19, do not, whatever else you do, tell yourself that you're just tired. Don't let the numbers comfort you, because the numbers are the very first thing they will use to take you. That cold, small feeling that the count is wrong is the truest instrument you will ever own. Truer than any gauge or readout I ever calibrated in 11 years. And the day I finally trusted it, instead of arguing it quietly down into silence, was the day I stopped being cargo and started being a man who got some of his people out the other side. The door held. That was never the problem, not for 1 second. The door did everything it was ever built to do and more. The problem was that I trusted the door more than I trusted the cold, small thing in my own chest that had been telling me, since the very moment the dogs first drove home on the first night, that the man standing so still by the water tank had arrived as the 20th body in a count of 19. The steel was real. The shelter was a lie. And the last safe place was only ever as safe as the moment I was finally willing to walk out of it. We are still walking. If a man with a calm, unchanging voice ever invites you somewhere with the lights already on and the gate already standing open, do me one small favor. The only thing I will ever ask of you. Listen for the catch on a word. The same catch every single time. And then turn around and go the other way.